Welcome, welcome in Poland. We have 5 days ahead of us, exciting days in Warsaw. That's one point in history, the capital of world Jewry. And I'm glad to say hello to you and to say hello to you in a big number. I think this is the greatest conference of AGM throughout its existence, and I'm sure that this is definitely thanks to the exciting place where we have the chance to meet today and during the next days. Thank you for all the colleagues of Poland, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, to host us tonight and in the next days. We now start to discuss where we are, where this museum is situated, the life and the discussions about Jewish life in Poland during the last years. And before we go in depth into that subject with our keynote speakers that we invited for this evening, I want to ask Dariusz Stoła, Professor Dariusz Stoła, the director of the Poland Museum of the History of Polish Jews, to welcome us all here in Warsaw.
I will follow the good example of Hanno and speak shortly. Welcome to the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. Welcome to the Polin Museum in Warsaw. We are very pleased and we are proud that you have accepted the invitation and make this museum the place of this year's conference of the association. And we are honored, in fact, because we are newcomers to the association. We are new to the club. In fact, a few weeks ago, we didn't even have the core exhibition. So we are a real museum only for a few weeks now. Not much experience, as you can understand. Although being a museum without a museum, in the first 18 months of operation inside this building, when we didn't have the core exhibition, we have attracted more than 400,000 visitors to an actual empty building, almost empty because we have had a number of very successful temporary exhibitions. So now we are quite optimistic, looking forward, and we start to believe that what everybody says, that we have a great exhibition. And when I say everybody, I mean all the major Western media and also some newspapers in China, Japan, and Indonesia. I don't know why they praise our core exhibition, but maybe they are right. So you will have a chance to see it yourself, and we will appreciate any comments, especially critical comments, because we are getting somehow used to all these enthusiastic remarks. So any critical remarks will be more than welcome. I wish you fruitful discussions. I wish you the pleasure of staying in Warsaw for these few days. Those of you who are coming from more sunny places than Warsaw at this time, I apologize. We have limited influence. Actually, we have exhausted all our influence on weather 3 weeks ago when we kept praying for the good weather for the opening, which we kept outside of the building. So now we cannot make anything about it. I would like to welcome 3 individual persons in this room in particular. One is Professor Dorota Folga-Januszewska, the president of the Polish ICOM, who hopefully, yes, she's present over there. Welcome. Mr. Marian Turski, who is the chair of the museum's council and the good spirit of this museum for many years. And Professor Barbara Kirschenglatt-Gimblet, the founding mother of this museum, the director of the core exhibition. Barbara, please stand up. Oh, yes. Barbara modestly sits in the last row. And finally, I would like to thank our donors who have made this conference possible. You can see the logos on the screen. This is the Koret Foundation and the Taube Foundation for Jewish Life and Culture, as well as the William K. Bowes Jr. Foundation, all 3 located in California, United States, and the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland, which is also a co-founder of our museum. So welcome again and enjoy the coming days in this building. Thank you.
So it took a long road to make this museum possible, and on this road, one of the cornerstone still standing is the Jewish Historical Institute. And I would love to ask Pavel Spivak, the head of this institute that so incredibly preserved the memory of Polish Jewry throughout ages, meanwhile already. Yeah. Please welcome our guests.
Welcome in Warsaw. I hope that I will be able to welcome you in the Institute. It will be Monday, I think 5 o'clock p.m. And I have to say one thing, that in comparison with this museum, we are a little bit older. It means that our museum, Jewish Museum, was created in 1948 with the exhibition devoted to the works of Jewish artists who were murdered during the Second World War. It was the real opening of the museum, of the Jewish Museum in our institution, and also, in some sense, it was the opening of the Jewish Historical Institute, which was a continuation of the historical committee connected with which was the part of the Central Committee of the Jews in Poland, formed in August 1944. And now in our museum, in our small museum, we have, I think, the best collection of the Jewish works. I think that part of it will be, you will see on our exhibition. We have more than 15,000 or around 15,000 different artifacts. So I think that we could, be, I hope, a good part of the association. And we hope that we will be able to also to work with our workshops and be able to show a little bit from our artifacts, our works, which we presented. So I wish you a good weather, first of all. Second, good discussion, and I wish you to meet nice and friendly people in Poland. Thank you.
Yeah, in a little addition to our program, I would love to ask Katarzyna Nowakowska-Sito on our stage, because she likes to read to all of us a very important address, welcoming address by Minister Małgorzata Omilionowska, who unfortunately can't be present tonight, but sent us a letter of welcome, and please read it to us.
Thank you, Hanno. I also welcome you to the museum very warmly, as I see many friends from other European museums I met last year in Munich. But today I will speak in the name of Professor Małgorzata Omilionowska, Minister of Culture and National Heritage. Dear sirs, it is with much interest that I have received information on a conference of the Association of European Jewish Museums to be this year by the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. The conference will be an excellent opportunity for foreign guests, experts on the history and culture of Jews in Europe, to visit your museum and its newly opened core exhibition. In my opinion, the creators of the core exhibitions of the Museum of the History of Polish Jews have successfully tackled the extremely difficult challenge of presenting the cruel history of the 20th century, which within just 5 years led to almost total annihilation of a 1,000-year-old heritage of the Jewish nation in Poland. The problems with the creators of the exhibition had to face will be reflected in the subject of the conference. As an art historian, I am perfectly aware of how important an authentic historic exhibit is in telling story. It constitutes a kind of key to a listener's imagination, the point around which the narration is centered, leading to relevant conclusions. What can a museologist do, however, who has to prepare an exhibition seeking to reconstruct a fragment of a past reality where no authentic artifacts are available? Attempts to answer questions like that will probably be made in the presentations you are preparing. I wish you, first of all, fruitful meetings and positive impressions from Warsaw and Łódź. Thank you.
During the course of our last conferences, it became a kind of tradition that our first keynote lecture is devoted to the place where we meet, to give us an idea about the spirit, the history, the philosophy, and also the discourse of the place where our conference takes place. Talking about Warsaw, talking about Poland, when we in the board started to discuss how to start this conference, to start this event, became a bit of tricky because we all know everything about Poland and nothing. And we thought that it would be a good idea to start that conference with a dialogue, but with a dialogue from within, with a dialogue about how the way the history of the Polish Jews was perceived during the years after 45 evolved, how it changed, how Jewish life changed in Poland, and what is the context of the idea to build such a museum with this grandeur, such a central place of memory, but also of discourse about a possible Jewish future. And we invited two guests to help us to start thinking about where we are here. And please welcome with us Monika Adamczyk-Garbowska and Konstantin Gebert in our round here. And we will start with Monika Garbowska, and she is a professor of comparative literature at the Marie Curie University in Lublin. She already published seminal books on Jewish writing in Poland, about the discourse about Jewish history and Jewish presence in Poland in the literature, in the Polish literature, and I'm very curious to hear your keynote lecture number 1. Thank you for coming to us.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor for me, and when I got interested in Jewish topics almost 40 years ago, it's hard to believe for myself. I would never think that there would be such an occasion. So it seems almost unreal. Since I am a literary scholar, I will illustrate my lecture with some quotations from literature, that some works that are probably very well known to Polish people who are here, but not so much to people from other countries. So I hope this might be interesting for you. Hannah Worth Nesher, in her book City Codes, Reading the Modern Urban Novel, this is a book published in 1996, in the chapter on Isaac Bashevis Singer's Warsaw, contrasts the situation of a Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe coming for a visit from the United States to look for his home place with that of other immigrants. She quotes an ad from the no longer existing Pan American Airlines, which, accompanied by a picture of an old man climbing the whitewashed steps of a Mediterranean street in an unidentified country, says, "Picture this, if you will. A man who spent all his life in the United States gets on a plane, crosses a great ocean, lands. He walks the same streets his family walked centuries ago. He sees his name, which is rare in America, filling 3 pages in a phone book. He speaks haltingly the language he had learned better as a child. All of us come from some place. Just once, you should walk down the same street your great-grandfather walked." This is the end of this ad. However, Hannah Nesher rightly notices that this type of experience couldn't be shared by American Jews, and here we can also add Israelis or Jews from other countries. Such visitors, if transported to Warsaw, wouldn't spot those comforting columns of names in the phone book, nor would they hear the background language of their childhood. They would be greeted by an ominous silence. No airline could fly them to a place where their second heritage still lives. For in the post-Holocaust era, it no longer exists anywhere but in collective memory. This is Hanna Nescher's comment. This is still largely true, but thanks to the revival of Jewish life in Poland and interest in Jewish history and culture on the part of non-Jews, there are more and more places that can serve at least as a substitute for the lost Jewish space. The Warsaw Museum of Polish Jews may be one of such places, as the visitor can at least partly relate to the culture and language of his or her grandfathers, for example, entering the Jewish street in the interwar gallery. While attending the official opening of the main exhibition on October 28, I had a sense of a very important historical moment. I come from a generation of Poles who grew up in the 1960s and 1970s knowing very little about Jewish history and culture. I got interested in those topics by pure coincidence in 1977 via novels by Isaac Bashevis Singer. It was very difficult to find any materials on Jewish topics at that time. You couldn't go to a bookstore and get a reference book on Jewish topics. Jewish Historical Institute was a dormant institution at that time, affected by the anti-Semitic campaign of 1968, so it wasn't an active and lively place like it is now. That's how Ruth Weiss, a distinguished scholar in the field of Jewish literature, now Professor Emerita of Harvard University, described her visit to Poland at that particular period. She visited Poland in the fall of 1977, and this article was published in Commentary in early 1978, and I quote from her article. Inquire at the many bookstores of Warsaw or Krakow for any volume on the Jews of Poland, either of the past or present, in any region of the north or south, in any aspect of ethnography or economics, and even the dullest student of language will quickly learn the words for there are none, nie ma, and nothing, nic. A trip to Poland in search of a Jewish presence is a journey of the mind alone, end of quote. At that time, studying Jewish topics had a taste of entering a mysterious and partly forbidden zone. One should be happy that with time, Jewish topics have become more common, more normal, that the very fact of dealing with them doesn't evoke such surprise or strong and contrasting emotions as in the past. Less and less often am I faced with questions asked with surprise or even suspicion, why in fact do I deal with this subject matter? In spite of that, I still think that, especially in Poland, it hasn't ceased to be a special topic. The museum has a chance of being a meeting ground for various people. Done with imagination, care, and expertise, it should be interesting for Jews, Poles, and other visitors. Obviously, there will be criticism and controversies, so the director, Professor Stolar, shouldn't worry. I am sure there will be critical comments and controversies. Some people will consider it too Polonocentric, others too critical of Poles, too detailed or not detailed enough. What is important is that its message is that there is no history of Poland without the history of the Jews, and no history of the Jews without the history of Poland, to quote late Professor Jakub Goldberg. He and other scholars, Polish Jews who contributed greatly to development of Jewish studies, most of them are no longer alive, would be amazed to see this museum. In Poland, quite often in the context of the destruction of Jewish life during the Second World War, a poem by Antoni Słonimski, an assimilated Polish Jew, is quoted. Let me read this poem, although the English translation doesn't fully render its melodic quality, but I think the translation is quite good and renders the content quite well. It was written soon after the war, in 1947, and describes the landscape after the Holocaust, focusing on little towns, but what it says can be applied to Poland after the war as a whole. The poem is entitled Elegy of Jewish Towns. There are no more Jewish towns in Poland, no more. In Hrubieszów, Karczew, Brody, Falenica, you'd look in vain for lit candles or try to catch the sounds of singing from a wooden temple. The last remains disappeared. Jewish rags, blood scattered like sand, traces cleared away, and walls whitewashed clean with strong lime, as after some plague or for a high holy day. One moon shines here, cool, pallid, alien, beyond the city, on the highway when night catches fire. My Jewish relatives, poetic fellows, will not find Chagall's 2 golden moons. These moons now course over another planet. They fluttered away, frightened in sad silence. These towns are no longer where a shoemaker was a poet, a watchmaker a philosopher, and a barber a troubadour. Those towns are no longer where the wind joined biblical airs with Polish song and Slavic sorrow, where old Jews in gardens beneath the shade of cherry trees mourned the holy walls of Jerusalem. These towns are no longer. They've passed like shadows, and these shadows will fall between our words, before 2 nations, nourished by the suffering of centuries, will approach each other fraternally and again unite. This poem, when quoted, is usually used for sentimental purposes, and only some stanzas, those about little towns gone, or Chagall's 2 moons, or the watchmaker, philosopher, are referred to. I want to stress more dramatic fragments of this poem, those about the last remains disappearing, traces cleared away, walls whitewashed clean as after some plague or for a high holiday. You have to know the situation in Poland after the war well to comprehend fully these words, the silence and also ambivalent attitude of many Poles, trying to forget about what happened and in a way celebrating that disappearance. This was obviously connected with the political situation. For 45 years after the Second World War, history in Poland and in other countries of the former communist bloc was the least independent subject, constituting a hotbed for manipulation. The selection of facts, and above all their interpretation, had precisely defined ideological dimensions. In the case of Jewish topics, their very absence or their incidental and distorted presentation made Jews almost a taboo issue, which couldn't be discussed openly. The resulting mystery around these questions made people either indifferent and ignorant or susceptible to biased opinions. A problem of equal importance is that up to 1989, very little attention was given, for example, in school curricula, to the long presence of Jews in Polish history. Most often, they would appear in connection to the Holocaust and quickly disappear again. Also, the last stanza of the poem was prophetic, about the shadows of destroyed Sztetlech little Polish Jewish towns falling between the words of Poles and Jews, divided rather than united by the suffering of centuries. The poet states that a lot of time will pass before the two nations will get closer together. The development of Jewish studies in Poland, even a kind of fashion for them, a revival of Jewish communal life, various festivals and other events are a step forward in this getting closer together, and I would like to believe that the museum in Warsaw will be an important meeting ground. Also, if we look at other parts of this poem about the sounds of singing from a wooden temple, or the moons now coursing over another planet, fluttering away, frightened, in sad silence, now, in the context of this museum, we can relate these words to the partial restoration of a wooden synagogue of Gwoździec, a display here, and express a hope that the moons are at least partly returning, less frightened, less silent, and less sad. The museum wouldn't have come into existence if not for the developments that took place in Poland over the last 30 or more years. When Jewish studies started being revived in the late 1980s, there were still a number of scholars born and at least partly educated before World War II, fluent in Yiddish, Hebrew, and Polish. Thanks to them, new generations of scholars developed in Poland who could handle the task with the help of their colleagues from the United States and Israel. The museum is a result of international cooperation which became possible on such a large scale when Poland entered its road to democracy. We should also see the museum in the context of other initiatives in Poland. There are a number of regional museums, for example, in Poland, where various initiatives take place to remind of Jewish inhabitants of these places, but it is still a problem that in many such museums, Jewish history doesn't have permanent exhibits. Usually, these are special events or temporary exhibitions. Hopefully, the museum in Warsaw will serve as a center stimulating other initiatives. Already there is a very valuable initiative, Museum on the Wheels, traveling to different small towns. It is similar with monographs about Polish cities and towns. In the communist period, quite often Jews were barely mentioned there. On the wave of interest in Jewish topics, a number of books were published focusing on Jewish communities, but in fact what is needed now are monographs covering Jewish history in the context of Polish history. Also, thanks to the international cooperation, more and more scholars abroad see the need to study the Polish language for the sake of Jewish studies or do research in Poland. When I wanted to study Yiddish 37 years ago, almost the only place in Poland where the language was taught was the Jewish theater in Warsaw. But I studied and then worked in Lublin, so it would have been very difficult to attend such lessons on a regular basis. So I got a chance to study Yiddish only when I obtained a fellowship of the American Council of Learned Societies in 1988. I studied Yiddish at Columbia University in New York. Now I run translation workshops from Yiddish into Polish and English for students from all over the world, including the United States, and they take place during the summer Yiddish school in Warsaw. Not far away from here, there is a Shalom Foundation and a very interesting Yiddish center. So this is an example of one of these shifts. Both Warsaw and Krakow, as well as other cities, including Lublin, Wrocław, or Łódź, have become recognized places on the map of Jewish studies. It is important that the museum is partly financed by the Polish government. Its location in Warsaw, political support, lots of publicity prove its significance in contemporary Poland. There is a tendency in the West to separate Jewish history from the history of Poland, or separating the Holocaust from the history of the Second World War. The museum tries to correct such an approach. A very important matter often discussed in Poland is the fact that many Jewish visitors, especially Israeli high school students, make pilgrimages to Poland that are almost exclusively focused on former death camps. There is now a hope that they will start their visit from the museum to see a larger context to Jewish history. Moreover, the knowledge of the rich history doesn't diminish the horror of the Holocaust. On the contrary, when one sees how rich Jewish life in Poland was, the loss seems even greater. The museum incorporates the Holocaust, and the Holocaust gallery is quite powerful, but it is arranged in such a way that you cannot enter the Holocaust gallery directly. You have to pass at least one other gallery in order to be aware that Jewish experience in Poland is not limited to the Holocaust. In a non-fiction story by Hanna Kral, a Polish Jewish writer, Holocaust survivor, the narrator and Thomas Blatt, a survivor of Sobibór concentration camp, drive through little towns in the Lublin region. Blatt mentions the names of the Jews who lived and perished there. Why is nobody sad, he asks. The sun is setting. Everything became even uglier and grayer, we read. Perhaps because ghosts are circling around. They do not want to go away when people do not regret their absence, when they are unmourned. All this grayness comes from the unmourned ghost, end of quote. The developments in Poland over the last decades, crowned by the creation of this museum, allow us to hope that the ghosts evoked in Hanna Kral's story will be able to rest in peace. The square where the museum stands now was before the war part of the lively Jewish quarter. During the war, it became the site of the ghetto, and after the liquidation of the ghetto, it was turned into rubble by the Nazis. After the war, with the gradual restoration of Warsaw, it became the site of commemorative events, especially after the monument to the ghetto heroes was erected. But it was still a hole, a wound, an almost empty area among newly erected housing developments. With the creation of the museum, as well as other commemorative elements, for example, Jan Karski's figure or the monument to the righteous soon to be erected, it is turning into a different type of space, commemorating the destruction, but also reminding of the richness of Jewish life and testifying to the presence of a Jewish community in Poland nowadays. Hopefully, Jewish visitors from abroad will see Warsaw as a friendly place now. Thanks to its high quality, it will also constitute a counterbalance to the pseudo-Jewish kitsch that one can encounter in many places in Poland, starting with Jewish-style restaurants and ending with figurines of Polish Jews, so-called lucky Jews, that often shock foreign visitors. It will be a place where interest in Jewish history and culture can be initiated, deepened, and developed. In May next year, a large conference will be held at the museum under the title From Ibrahim ibn Yaqub to 6 Anielewicz Street, with the purpose of reviewing the present state of knowledge and research on the history and culture of Polish Jews, and identifying topics that require further studies. This will probably be the largest conference of this kind since the conference in Jerusalem in 1989, initiated by leading Israeli scholars with roots in Poland, including Professor Honer Szmeruk of blessed memory. 26 years ago, such a conference couldn't have taken place in Poland. Now, Warsaw seems a natural site for such an event. Professor Ruth Weiss, who in the 1970s and 1980s published two important reports from Poland. From one of them I quoted at the beginning, and the titles were very significant: Poland Without Jews and Poland's Jewish Ghosts, will be the keynote speaker at a conference in September next year, marking the 100th anniversary of the death of Yitzhak Leib Peretz, one of the most important Yiddish writers. It will be held in this museum and in Zamość, Peretz's hometown, in a newly restored synagogue, and co-organized by, among others, the museum and the Polish Association of Yiddish Studies. Just to think that in Poland now there are two large scholarly associations, the Polish Association of Jewish Studies and separate Polish Association of Yiddish Studies, shows the enormous change. During my research in the US, Israel, or France, I visited Jewish museums there. While visiting Yad Vashem or Diaspora Museum, now Museum of the Jewish People, Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., Jewish Museum in Paris, I always felt very acutely the absence of a Jewish museum in Poland. The scope of this museum allowed for incorporating some of the best elements that can be found in other museums, but in spite of some similarities, it has a character of its own. For example, I cannot think of any other Jewish museum, I might be wrong, where the Yiddish component could be so rich, like in this museum. As Professor Moshe Rossman of Bar Ilan University, who was a consultant also for this museum, described it, it is categorically Jewish and distinctly Polish. Often in the political context, we come across opposition, Polish versus Jewish. But in the cultural sense, Polishness or Jewishness rather complement each other and often create a unique whole. Obviously, we can understand these two terms differently, but I understand them in an inclusive rather than exclusive way. The museum tells a story starting with a legendary past and ending with the regained Jewish presence. When you enter this story, with your eyes wide open, you might see that this museum is so Jewish because it's so Polish, and so Polish because it's so Jewish. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to situate the museum in the hope of a vivid place for visitors. I also would love to now introduce Konstanty Gebert, who is one of the most prolific political writers of Poland for many, many years, as an essayist, as a journalist, as a thinker. He was active in the Polish underground, and his books have quite a span, from a book about the ex-Yugoslav civil war to Torah commentary, books about contemporary Jewry, and I would love to hear you lecture about the museum as a possible part of Jewish life in Poland or not.
Thank you for this very kind and totally undeserved introduction. Good evening, Agit Voch, Shavuot Tov. A museum of the history of Polish Jews. Seems nothing would be more straightforward. You've got Jews, you've got Poland, they have a long history, let's have a museum. And then, as all of you know, the problems immediately arise. Let's forget about the footnote issue. So do we include Polish Jews not in Poland? Menachem Begin, does he have a place in this museum or not? This is technical. But what exactly is a Jew? And in fact, what exactly is Poland? So do we, until say the 19th century, this is again relatively simple. The Jews are in the state like in the ghettos, and Poland is on the map. And then Poland gets off the map, and the Jews get out of the state like in the ghettos. How far do we track down the Jews? How far genealogically? How far geographically? Once Poland is reestablished, a substantial chunk of what used to be Poland is no longer Poland. Niemirów is outside of Poland. Do the Jews of Niemirów in the 20s and 30s merit a mention in the Museum of History of Polish Jews? They didn't stop being Polish Jews, and Poland didn't choose not to be Niemirów anymore. Do assimilated Jews count? Well, of course not. How do you choose? But this, again, this is basic staple. This is what Jewish intellectuals do before breakfast, debate who is, who isn't. But then it really gets interesting when you realize that in describing Jewish modernity, you really need to have an interpretative key. Until the walls of the ghetto fall down, until the Jews leave the Städtler, their history can be reasonably interpreted through their own self-perception of it, with external perception being an interesting footnote. With the onset of modernity, what key do we adopt in understanding Jewish history? Today, we've got three main keys. The Zionist one, which says that essentially the Galut was not only a disaster but a failure. It ends with the Shoah, and Jewish history picks up again where it rightly should, in Eretz Yisrael. The assimilationist one, which says that the experience of the Galut is an experience of breaking down bias and prejudice and becoming accepted as full citizens in the different countries we belong to. And the religious perspective, which says we have always been defined by our relationship to God. And no matter where we live, this is what determines us. Those three interpretative keys were, of course, present in Polish Jewish life when there still was a Jewish nation in Poland until the war. But a fourth perspective, which I could call Bundist, came to be the most prevalent, if not necessarily majoritarian, and it showed Polish Jews as a native nation in Poland, not guests, contrary to what Polish anti-Semites would say, and not going anywhere, contrary to what Zionists hope. A nation which defined itself as a people, not as a religion. We stay Jewish even if we stop being religious, putting paid to the idea that we're first and foremost a religion. And the nation which, although appreciative of the fact that so many prominent Jews choose to write in different language and become parts of different cultures, would actually prefer to have the Tuwims and Słonimskis back in home and writing in Yiddish instead of showing off to the Goyim. This perspective is the one largely adopted by this museum, and it will come as a shock to many Jewish visitors who have forgotten that this was a legitimate Jewish perspective. And the fact that those who adhered to it were murdered is not an argument in the historical debate. But Jewish visitors, of course, are in for more than that one shock. They will be also stunned to discover, as Professor Monika Garbarczyk has eloquently told us, just how Polish Jewish history was. Actually, if there is something that Poles and Jews would agree on now, is that we've lived together for hundreds of years, it didn't work out, good riddance. Well, no. As a bare minimum, we can't get rid of the past. Jewish history in Poland was Polish, and Polish history was Jewish. it is impossible to de-intertwine, as it were, the two. And this, of course, would be also a shock for Polish visitors who come to this museum as the best and only museum of the history of Poland currently available, and discover just how much that history was Polish, was Jewish. So while the visitors will contemplate their mutual shocks and surprises, they will also note that this history is so rich that the rest of the planet is excluded. In something which seems to be very typically Jewish and very typically Polish, the rest doesn't really matter. I mean, the world isn't present in this museum. Even if it does have a bearing on the story the museum tells, but we'll find very little about, forget world history, world Jewish history. I mean, the expulsion from Spain, the Haskalah, whatever. They get mentioned in footnotes, but basically, it is as if what really mattered in Jewish history happened here anyway. And to a surprising extent, it's true. Most, not all, but most important phenomena determining Jewish history developed in Poland once there was a Jewish life in Poland. Okay, so the Torah was not given in Warsaw. But apart from that, if you look at Hasidut and at Litvak intellectualism, if you look at Jewish socialism and Jewish assimilationism, if you look at the Jewish theater, cinema, newspapers, if you look at Yiddish literature, I mean, I could go on and on. I love going on and on. But basically, most of what matters for Jewish life today is from here. So why bother about the world? But if all this seems a very fertile grounds for fascinating discussions, discussions in Poland regarding this museum really dealt with something else. Polish fears were, again, as Professor Garbaczyk told us, is that the museum would be anti-Polish. You see, it would give Poland a bad name. It would make Jews think that Poles didn't like Jews. How can that be? High-level political meetings were held to discuss the subject, including in top political offices of the country, and then getting the museum reviewed. Very high-ranking politicians would say, well, I feel relieved. I see this is not anti-Polish. Nowhere else in the world, Israel emphatically included, would anybody worry so much about the political impact of Jewish history. This is very much a Polish specificity. So debates and quite acute conflicts occur over just how much of Polish anti-Semitism should be presented. You will see the result. My opinion, the presentation is fair and adequate. And actually, what's even more interesting is that Jewish life in Poland isn't reduced to anti-Semitism. Polish visitors will be surprised at how prevalent the anti-Semitism was, how much of a fixture of everyday Jewish experience, regardless of epoch and geographical location. But Jewish visitors will be surprised at just how much more there was than anti-Semitism. Another Polish concern, very serious and very loudly articulated, was, will the museum pay sufficient attention to something that in Polish is called Żydokomuna, Jew communism. We have amongst us tonight Professor Paweł Śpiewak, who actually wrote a monograph on the issue of Jew communism, at the same time describing it as a fixture of the imagination and a somewhat sociological reality. But potential critics of the museum wondered, will the museum not conceal the fact that those horrible Jews were involved in horrible communism? And no, it doesn't. It shows that, yes, you had Jews involved in communism the way you had Jews involved in Zionism, you had Jews involved in conservative politics and liberal politics. You had Jews involved in most everything Jews could be involved in. Again, this will come as a surprise to those who tend to think of the Jewish role in Polish history mainly as a nefarious one, hostile, malevolent, and evil, and Jew communism becoming its epitome. But these discussions, as ridiculous as they may seem, were very serious, very protracted, and still echo as the museum stops being an idea and a concept and becomes a material reality. But what the museum does not and cannot resolve is a fundamental issue in perception of history between Poles and Jews. Because both nations have been kidded into believing that just because we share the geography for hundreds of years, we share the same history. And then when we, whichever we we're speaking about, we Jews or we Poles, discover just how different their, whoever the they will be, Poles or Jews, how their vision is of the events we know because are part of our history, we get angry, outraged, insulted, and essentially believe that the others must be acting in bad faith to create such a distorted vision of events. And in fact, we do not have the same history. We've got two histories that intertwine, occasionally merge, occasionally diverge, and at times bear very little resemblance between themselves. To give you just two possible examples amongst a wealth of. On September 1739, the Soviet Union invades eastern Poland and occupies half of the country. And on a visible number of occasions, the invader is received by cheering Jewish welcome committees. This is a fact which is well described in memoirs from the period, both Polish and Jewish ones. Now, while the representativity of those welcome committees may be put into doubt, I somehow do not see Jewish industrialists cheering the fact that their industries will be nationalized, rabbis cheering the fact that synagogues will be closed down, Zionists and other Jewish politically active militants cheering the fact that they'll be sent to Siberia, although actually that was much better than the alternative, as it soon turned out. Therefore, I do not see many Jews having much reason to cheer. Yes, I can easily imagine that people did cheer spontaneously and genuinely because this was the Red Army, it wasn't the Wehrmacht. By September 17th, that was all there was in the menu. From a Polish perspective, the choice might seem very subtle. From a Jewish perspective, it wasn't. The Red Army was infinitely preferable to the Wehrmacht, regardless of what might follow later. Second, quite a few Jews cheered because they actually thought that becoming part of the Soviet Union will be an improvement. Poland didn't exactly go out of its way to welcome Jews as equal citizens. To the contrary, it basically told them day in and day out that it would love to be rid of them. It just doesn't know how. And in this invading Red Army, you had Jewish officers, something that was an extreme rarity in the Polish army, to say the least. But also, many Jews would have thought that, well, we got invaded, but at least we got invaded by the future, right? I've seen the future and it works. The Soviet Union is where all of humanity should be going, and the fact that it actually came to us, we're lucky. Those illusions didn't survive the first weeks and months of the encounter, but I can easily imagine them motivating people. And finally, yes, there was Schadenfreude. A one-liner often quoted in reports from that time has Jews telling their Polish acquaintances, you wanted Poland without the Jews? Well, you get the Jews without the Poland, serves you right. Nasty, yes, but not entirely incomprehensible or surprising. But while on the Jewish side we can make this sophisticated analysis of complex motives and complicated reasons, what the Polish neighbors were seeing was treason. If the word treason has any meaning, this is it. A foreign army invades the country and the neighbors cheer. So just exactly how can we get a compromise vision between those two? Fast forward to Warsaw 1943. Simcha Rataizer, a member of the Jewish Fighting Organization, gets smuggled across the ghetto walls in a desperate attempt to buy weapons for the Jewish underground in preparation for the final rising. He fails and he watches the uprising from the outside, eventually goes inside the ghetto to rescue his surviving comrades. In a report that many of you must have heard when you saw Lanzmann's Shoah, he describes his first impression of Warsaw in April 43. And Rataizer says, Warsaw was a city at peace. Girls were walking around with bouquets of flowers. People were sitting in coffee shops, drinking coffee. Orchestras were playing in parks. Warsaw was a city at peace. By Warsaw, of course, he meant the quote-unquote Aryan side, because he came from the ghetto. From the ghetto, Warsaw in April 43 was a city at peace. The difference between the two experiences was so huge, it couldn't even be verbalized. The difference between the two sides of the ghetto wall in Warsaw was greater than between occupied Warsaw and occupied Paris, and we do know that the occupation in France was incomparably gentler than the occupation in Warsaw. But I would venture to say that it was greater than the difference between occupied Warsaw and free London. The ghetto belonged in a universe apart, the same universe as the German death camps and the Soviet Gulag. Everything else paled by comparison. But in order to call Warsaw a city at peace in April 43, you had to come from the ghetto. This was a period in which German repressions against the quote-unquote Aryan population had sharply increased. You had the first mass repressive executions in retaliation for actions of the underground. Germans would surround the building, drag out the inhabitants, execute them on the spot, usually having their mouths covered with plaster so the screams would not disturb the functionaries, and then the bodies left there as a warning for others. The first mass dragnets of people to be herded off to slave labor in Germany were taking place. People would disappear, and their families, often only after the war, would discover that they had in fact been just taken to work as slaves in Germany and not executed on the spot. From the Polish perspective, therefore, there was not much of a difference between the two sides of the wall. We suffered, the Jews suffered. What's the big deal? What's the difference? The difference is simple. 90% of the ethnic Poles survived the war. 90% of Polish Jews did not. But you have to be Jewish to understand that. From the Polish perspective, it's all the same. There is a level of horror beyond which gradation seems impossible. And Poles tend to be quite offended when they hear that Jews actually suffered more. In a recent public opinion poll, 61% of Poles believed that during the war, Poles suffered as much as Jews, or possibly more. Here again, there is no negotiated compromise vision of history. In both cases, we are not describing ancient history. We're describing history which has not, we are describing memory which is in the process of becoming history, but can still be testified to by living witnesses. In fact, if we are criticizing this memory, we're criticizing grandfather. Don't give me bullshit, mister. My grandfather was there. He saw it. He told me. I know. You can't compete against grandfather. And in a way, it's a good thing. I mean, we should trust our grandparents. The problem is that the two grandfathers on the two sides of the ghetto wall, or on the two sides in an occupied Polish town, so remembered and repeated very different visions of history. Confronted with the other vision, as I said, we're stunned and then angry. This must be a lie, and they must know they're lying. The only way to break out of this is to accept, for the sake of the discussion, that from where the other guy is sitting, his story is as credible as mine is from where I'm sitting. Now, this doesn't mean we accept that he's right. He's wrong. We know he's wrong. We simply are willing to suspend our anger because we make an assumption of good faith. He's wrong, but in good faith. He isn't lying. He isn't trying to con me or to insult me. He's simply uninformed, the poor thing. We have to accept the poor ignorant and tolerate him. Without this, no understanding is possible. But it takes a great effort to make this kind of leap of faith against the evidence told us by grandfather. It might well turn out that this museum will be a place which will make this leap of faith slightly less impossible. That the story that we're told here, with its complexities, with its contradictions, with its surprises, just possibly might jolt us out of our belief that we don't really need to come here, we know it all. Grandfather told us. And if the museum will help us in believing that grandfather, of course, told us the truth, but possibly not the entire truth. Possibly there might be more to the story. Then it will have served its purpose not only as an institution of learning, this is relatively easy, but an institution of understanding. Fingers crossed, it has only started, but I don't think this is mission impossible. Thank you.
Okay, so I just heard we have still 10 minutes for discussion, so please join me on the stage. Thank you so much for sharing with us these two, I think at least in detail, pretty distinctly different visions of the museum. One more enthusiastic, one more with implicit doubts. And I mean, the question that came to my mind listening to the two of you was, is that museum, and I think this is a question we won't answer tonight, but I think it could lead us a little through the experience of the next days. Is this a museum that primarily is closing wounds and making Warsaw a more hospitable place for visitors? Or is it a place, the museum, I mean, that opens a discourse and a potential for even Jewish life in the future, which I think is not exactly the same?
Well, I think one doesn't exclude the other. Wounds have to be, first of all, they have to be identified and they have to be cured and treated and not hidden. And this was the problem with in Poland after the war. Because of the political situation. Probably if Poland became a democratic country after the war, well, first of all, there would be a larger Jewish community in Poland now, hopefully, and lots of these things that were discussed only in recent decades would have been discussed earlier, like in other countries. For example, things like Jedwabne, generally the attitude of Poles towards the Holocaust, or Szmalcowniks, or lots of these kind of so-called shameful chapters in Polish history. And it's very good that those things have been discussed and are still being discussed. For example, thanks to the discussion, thanks to the publication of Jan Tomasz Gross's book on Jedwabne in the year 2000, for the first time those topics entered the public discourse. I remember the evening news for a number of days would start with the recent news on Jedwabne. Earlier those topics were discussed. For example, one such very important discussion started in 1987 after the publication of the essay by Jan Błoński, Poor Poles Look at the Ghetto. But this, at that time, this discussion was limited to elites. This was a discussion between intellectuals, and with time it kind of made a larger circle. And the same here. It depends what gallery you visit. If you, let's say, visit the Holocaust gallery or the post-war gallery, there are still some things that haven't been examined and that will be examined. But I guess, like in any history or in any, let's say, family, there are these skeletons in the cupboard that should be identified. So I think there are kind of both sides. It's like, pulling the string in both directions.
I'll start from the end. You asked at the end about the impact of this museum on Jewish life. It would help the revival of Jewish life. This is not a Jewish institution. This is an institution about the Jews, but it is not a Jewish institution. And it's important to be able to separate the two, because the debate in Poland about understanding the past is a debate about Jews, but it's not a Jewish debate. It's a Polish debate. And the ultimate subject of that debate is the kind of Poland we want to have. Jews function in this debate as a litmus test. Instead of asking a long list of questions about where somebody stands politically, you ask him where he stands about the Jews, and you can more or less figure out where he stands on everything else. If he or she is anti-Semitic, he'll also probably be anti-democratic, authoritarian, anti-European, homophobic, misogynic, nationalist, Catholic fundamentalist. You don't have to run through the cafeteria. You just ask one question, and vice versa. So there is a Poland for which this museum is a closing of wounds, because you close wounds by, A, recognizing that they're out there. If you don't recognize there's a wound, you bleed to death, right? It closes wounds, it cleanses wounds, it includes those wounds in our self-definition of Poland, democratic, open, tolerant, capable of facing up also to its shameful past. And for this Poland, the Poland that, for example, Professor Monika represents here, this certainly is a positive and welcome development. There is a Poland that will feel aggressed by this museum, that will see this museum as opening old wounds, actually adding new wounds, putting a burden on the country, totally unnecessary at best, or actually actively hostile and anti-Polish at worst. This is a debate that the country is going through and that the museum will play a part in. Now, obviously, there's a Poland I root for, and there's a Poland that I actively dislike. And this, of course, is reciprocated on, at least on this we agree. I mean, they don't want me in their Poland. I don't want them in my Poland either. So at least on this we agree. And the gradient of change is shifting in the favor of those who want a Poland that is able to critically examine its past. But social processes are slow. And if I sounded skeptical, I'm not skeptical about the museum per se. I'm a late convert. I was skeptical of the concept, and I was forced by reality to actually accept the fact that most of my fears were unfounded. I came to like the museum and like the exhibit, but I am less enthusiastic than many about the capacity of institutions to produce social change. Social change is produced by experience, and this is the one commodity that we won't have. Information enough is not enough.
Thank you so much. I think this was a lot of food for thought. Now let's spend a thought about food. I think it's prepared outside and waiting for us. I think we had a great start into our conference. On the behalf of all the board, we want to welcome you again in this conference in Warsaw. And now we come to a lot of talking, a lot of eating, I assume. And please have fun together.